No, there's some chalk there. So a couple of things that I would start with, just because I can't resist and because I love these topics so much. So I thought, honestly, I thought I would just start on the topic of Netflix, because I happen to agree with Raul completely. But I would describe the phenomenon coming at it from the perspective of the ISPs a little differently, in that I've always thought of the cable operators, I think I talked about this here last year, as the video product is simply, or you can decompose the video product into the pass-through of the programming itself, and then on top of that, what many people refer to as the video gross margin, and that's what Jonathan Chaplin talked about in his presentation, was the video gross margin. I tend to think of that as the transport function. It is, so think of it as, and the analogy I always return to is the gas station, right? A gas station has wildly volatile margins depending on what the price is for gas. But if you, that they're paying refineries for gasoline. But if you strip out the volatility in the underlying commodity and say that has nothing to do with what a gas station does, a gas station is not in the business of selling gas. The gas station is in the business of storage and pumping. It stores the gas and it puts it in your car. And for that, they charge a relatively fixed price per gallon, regardless of whether the cost per gallon is $2 or $4. And so as the $2 and $4 price of gasoline fluctuates, their margins look like they are wildly rising or falling depending on the price of the commodity, but in fact it's an extremely stable business that charges about 10 cents a gallon for storage and pumping. That's what the cable business is. It is a business that charges about $40 for storage and pumping. And the storage and pumping function has actually been about $40 a month per subscriber for time immemorial. Now, if you are, and as Jonathan illustrated, all of the inflation in the price of your pay TV subscription is in programming cost. All of it. And in fact, that storage and pumping margin has actually compressed quite sharply for smaller operators and stayed about constant for large ones. The genius of Netflix, I think, was that if you're really a student of the value chain, it's not purely the transport function that I'm talking about. It's actually two functions. It is the function of transport and it is the function of aggregation and navigation. The aggregation navigation function and the transport function aren't priced separately because there is no external market. So you pay a single price and it's up to us to speculate how you would allocate value between those two things. But as an economist who looks at the sum of those being about $40 and says, well, replication of the navigation and aggregation function is something that a college kid with a PC could probably do a halfway decent job at. And replication of the transport function would take about $300 billion in 30 years. So let's say we take the $40 and we allocate $39.95 to transport and 5 cents to navigation. In essence, what Netflix did was it said, we're going to go after that 5-cent navigation opportunity and we're going to try to convince everybody that it's the $40 transport opportunity. And they actually succeeded in convincing both Wall Street and, more importantly, Washington that what they were competing for was the $40 transport opportunity. To the point that net neutrality became about pricing transport at zero in order to protect Netflix's $40 opportunity, which never should have been a $40 opportunity to begin with. It should have been a 5-cent opportunity, right? And what's happening is as time goes on and technology catches up with it, it's exposed to be a much smaller opportunity. And that's, I think, what Raul was saying was, look, the opportunity that they're competing for has low barriers to entry. The function of content aggregation and navigation isn't really all that big a deal. It's just not. And while there's some long-term lockups and you could write some checks that give you scale that buys you some defense for a time, when you're playing, as Raul said, against players like Apple and like Google and the kind of checks that they can write if and when they decide to write them, those advantages are going to prove to be, I think, fairly transitory. So anyway, for what it's worth, I also couldn't resist just a quick comment on vertical integration and the idea of vertical integration. Look, vertical integration, let's go back to the gas model. Vertical integration, as all of you know as economists, is typically evidence of a poorly functioning market. That is, where there are market inefficiencies that are sufficiently profound that they jeopardize one or another business. One of the ways you solve that is through vertical integration. You know, the classic example is oil refineries that say I need to own upstream supply in order to make sure that the refinery has a guaranteed supply of oil and therefore never has to decycle and recycle because that's just so expensive to do. And then I make sure that I have downstream distribution, that is gas stations, for exactly the same purpose, to make sure that the refinery never has to decycle and recycle. And so those models actually are utterly irrelevant for the media business. And so usually, the argument that you get for vertical integration, at least in the US market, but it's actually true in Europe as well, is usually the argument is exclusivity. Exclusivity is a way to transfer value from one layer of the value chain to another. And to the extent that and in this case, it is always extracting value from content and transferring it to the distribution layer. So the distribution layer can say, I have exclusivity for, let's say, ESPN, right? If a distributor bought ESPN and had that exclusivity, then they could capture retail distribution margin through the form of market share for a larger number of customers. It's such an obvious and simple way to try to extract value that it's illegal in the United States. The program access rules said that is verboten. And as long as the program access rules remain in place, it's very, very hard to make a sensible strategy out of vertical integration. Now, you can postulate that the program access rules will sunset, and there's been a lot of talk that maybe they will. But I would argue that it would be a crazy strategy to spend a large amount of money on the assumption that the program access rules will sunset. And therefore, and the program access rules, for those of you that don't know, say that it is that anyone who is vertically integrated and owns content has to make that content available to their competitors on an equal and non-discriminatory basis.
On regulated prices or on negotiated?
On an equal and non-discriminatory basis, which leaves some room for mischief in that you could price it to yourself at ridiculously high prices and say you are being non-discriminatory.
Yeah.
But there's ways that they solve for that in consent decrees around transactions. And so ultimately, but if someone said, well, I'm going to bet that the program's access rules sunset, and I'm going to buy ESPN from Disney, and therefore I'm going to make it exclusive over my platform, whether it's Dish or DirecTV, AT&T, or whether it's Comcast. It would be a suicidally dangerous strategy because almost certainly the public policy backlash would be so great that they would reimpose the program access rules, and you would be back to, well, that strategy just fell apart. So I can't, personally, I think it's an interesting exercise in the theory of microeconomics, but it's not a practical strategy in the United States.
Program access applies only to MVPDs, right?
Any vertically integrated MVPD.
So if you're not in Netflix,
yes, so that's a perfect example, right? So if Netflix said, I'm going to exclusively buy access to the NFL, and you can only get, now first of all, the NFL would probably say that's not in our long-term best interest to restrict access to any one platform, and what have you. But let's say the check was big enough. The risk that Congress would say we're going to come in and change that because the one thing you can get the Democrats and Republicans to agree on is protecting the right to see football, maybe the only thing, would be too high to actually make it a viable business strategy. Anyway, okay, so here's what I wanted to mostly talk about. I'm going to do it fast because I don't want to take too much time. But we just published yesterday some really interesting work, and I credit the real heavy lifting to Altman Valandry and Company, with whom we work. They are a market research firm, and they had the benefit of a massive consumer conjoint survey, which, for those of you that have fielded in-depth consumer conjoint surveys. They're extraordinarily expensive to do because they're so cumbersome and time-consuming and what have you. So, but having the benefit of having some rather deep-pocketed sponsors from the distribution and content community, they were able to pull off something that we obviously never could have been able to fund on our own. And they were generous enough to allow us to work with them to create a number of proprietary simulations. I'll summarize, and this will be in broad strokes, what the demand curve looks like for OTT video. And the curve was something like this. It says, as you can imagine, if you do a $20 product, a $30 product, a $40 product, a $50 product, and a $60 product, and I'm going to get these slightly wrong, and there is no perfect right answer because they're all different simulations of what content you put in the bundle. But these were not just generic, what would I be willing to pay? These were forced choice conjoint analyses based on max diff analyses based on actual choices of selections of channels and what have you. And what we did was create what we suspect will be the bundle that is most likely for Hulu to come to market with. It will include the Time Warner channels now, the Turner channels, now that Turner has entered that joint venture. We assume that it will ultimately include CBS, which is a reasonable bet. The curve looks something like this. If you can price that at $20, and these are all for the same package, so this is not a skinnier bundle and a fatter bundle. This is for the bundle that is something like CBS, something like what Hulu's likely to include. If you priced it at $20, you would get something like, and I forget what this is because it's an irrelevant data point because they can't price it at $20, but if they could, it's something like 25% of respondents said, yeah, I would do that. But when you get down to slightly more reasonable numbers, $30 is something like 15%. $40 is about 9%. $50 is about 6%, or sorry, about 3%. $60 is a little less than 1%. And here's the really interesting thing about this curve. It's a pretty steep curve. And the interesting thing about this curve is the cost of the programming itself is somewhere around here. It's about $39 if you assume that the programming is priced at the same price as the programming for a traditional video package. One of the questions we raised in the report that we published yesterday is that a sensible way to think about the pricing of the content? Because if you are a media company, what else do you have to think about? I think it's very tempting to say, well, if I sell to Hulu, myself in this case, since they own Hulu, or if I sell to DirecTV Now or any other OTT provider, as long as I charge the same price on a per subscriber basis as I charge in the linear world, well, then I'm economically indifferent as to whether it goes via Hulu or whether it goes via DirecTV Now or whether it goes via linear DirecTV. Well, it turns out that's not actually correct. There are a number of other considerations that you have to price in if you are a media company, including, first I have to think about piracy. Right? It turns out that about 20 to 40% of all Netflix subscriptions are stolen. They are borrowed passwords. Reed Hastings says that's not a problem. The media companies would beg to differ. It is kind of a problem. Let's say realistically you think that you can manage that down to 10%. Then each subscription that you sell to an OTT provider displaces about 1.1 subscriptions in the offline world, right? What about second homes? Switching from lowercase to caps. I don't know why, but second homes are about 5% of the pay TV market, and if I make a subscription that is truly portable, I'm going to start to displace second homes. I personally would say, why would I pay for 2 subscriptions at my weekend place instead of having just one? That turns out that that's about 1.05. What about the the pricing of, let's take Hulu first, because Hulu is owned and operated, so it makes a really interesting economic model. Because if I'm pricing to Hulu and I have to think about owning the entire economics of Hulu as an enterprise, well, I typically raise my prices to linear distributors at 8% per year. Now, either I can have Hulu raising its prices to customers, retail prices at 8% a year, which let's just get our head around that for a minute and acknowledge that's a crazy model. Or alternatively, if I'm not going to raise my prices 8% a year, then I'm going to have the equally crazy model of raising my prices 26% every 3 years. I've got one of those two choices. But if I'm going to raise my prices 26% every 3 years, in order to be economically indifferent between the existing model, and I'll come back to whether that's a reasonable assumption in a second. But if I'm going to do that, I can't say I'll catch up after the end of 3 years, or I'm going to average 13% below over the course of the contract, right? So I have to anticipatorily increase my prices by, let's say, 13%. So I've got anticipatory pricing of 4.13. And I can go on down the list and come up with all kinds of other things, but a big one is seasonality, right? Which is, a lot of this is about live sports. Once I make it frictionless for customers to add and drop, I am inevitably going to get customers who sign up for football season and leave after football season, or sign up for football and basketball season but aren't interested in baseball season. And let's say that the full year subscription that I get in the linear model turns into 10 months on average for the average customer who goes through this model. Well, then I have a 17% hit for that. And here's the problem, is when I start to layer in those additional costs and say, this is actually not the point of economic indifference. And by the way, I'm also giving away something more here. I'm giving Hulu or DirecTV Now or whoever it is wireless rights that are a unique set of rights. I also have, by the way, one that I forgot to mention here, and that is my stacking and SVOD rights, right? Is I sell a bunch of stuff to Netflix that probably now I'm not going to sell to Netflix. I'm going to keep on Hulu to make the Hulu product more attractive, but I have to make myself whole for that too. As I step out this curve, you get to something like this, which says there's probably about a 3% market opportunity based on what I actually have to charge for these services. And by the way, who is it? And this is intuitively obvious to anyone, I think. Ask a bunch of people who is most likely to want to spend $50 on an OTT video product, and the answer is not somebody who's spending $10 today and is wishing they could spend $40 more. It's someone who's spending $100 today and wishes they could spend $50 less, right? And so overwhelmingly, who's coming here? It's the people who already have pay TV, and it's effectively a cannibalization exercise. And so what I'm really doing is I'm trading down a large part of the market. Now, all of that is a rather elaborate way of just validating what Jonathan Chaplin said earlier, which is the media companies are the losers here, right? Because I think you look at this exercise and you say, there is simply not a way that you can preserve the economics and still create an ecosystem that is going to be attractive to customers. Why is that? It's because you've been overcharging for years, right? That's all it is, right? It's you've been overcharging and over-earning for a generation. And as the ecosystem changes, it becomes harder to overcharge and over-earn. And therefore, that consumer surplus, or that surplus that used to be yours, becomes consumer surplus. I would differ with Jonathan in the argument that the winners here are the distributors. I think the distributors, by and large, are somewhat indifferent, actually. It's probably a slight negative. The idea that the distributors can just jack up the price of broadband to compensate is really much more of a regulatory question than it is an economics question of it has nothing to do with the interaction of the utility between the two services. It's just you either can or you can't. And there's a natural impulse to say I would like to make up any lost economics somewhere, but whether you can or whether you can't has nothing to do with what's happening here. I'll leave it there. There's lots more interesting things to talk about, but I want to leave some time for tuna. But to me, this is a really, really interesting time because it says that the ecosystems in media are all scrambling to try to preserve something that is unpreservable, right? It is. I always describe media as, and the whole media ecosystem, as one of only two business models that I've ever seen that are almost perfectly designed to extract rents from consumers. The other one is the American consumer healthcare system. It is for exactly the same reasons, by the way, which is that all of the price signals in the market are hidden from the end user through this two-tier distribution system that we've got, where Disney raises prices to Comcast and Comcast gets yelled at for it. And that model, which is exactly the same as the relationship between insurers and doctors and drug companies, is the reason why we've had supernormal price increases in healthcare for a generation. And it's why we've had supernormal increases in the media ecosystem for a generation for programmers. And it raises a really interesting question, right? Which is just what happens when if you're a programmer and you're saying, I can't wait to go into this new world because what I want to do is own the customer, and if I'm the owner of Hulu, I can own the customer, and there's so much economic value, and all of that profit that exists at the distributors is now going to be mine because I have disintermediated them and I have gone direct to the consumer. Well, an economist would say that'd probably be the dumbest idea you could ever do, right? Because you are taking an ecosystem that has been so unbelievably attractive that it has allowed you to price at 2 times the rate of inflation for 30 consecutive years. And you're about to trade it for an unbelievably pedestrian system that is, I'm just going to go straight to the consumer and I'm going to tell them about my own price increases. Well, good luck. So I'll leave it there.
Okay.